Hello, and welcome to another episode of Speak to Save sessions. Speak to Save, as in Speak to Spiritual Abuse and Violence Eradication Project. You're here with me, Mariam Mahmood, and today our focus is on spiritual abuse in cases of toxic masculinity, whereby abusers use their faith as a ruse to justify their aims and outcomes, specifically in cases where they are expounding this myth of masculinity and abusing their victims using that. So this session is aimed at young male survivors specifically, because I often realize that most of the cases I speak about rather are related to young women and children, specifically in Muslim communities. With that in mind, I have a wonderful guest here with me today who is an expert academic who works on decoloniality, Islam, and global politics. Please welcome Junaid Ahmed. Junaid, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mariam, so much for having me.
Brilliant. So I guess my first question, just to dive right in, um, is exactly what I said in the introduction: spiritual abuse directed towards young men. I want to know how it manifests. So, how do these abusers approach their victims? How does it all pan out?
Right. I think that by now there's so much empirical evidence to suggest within religious circles, and of course we're speaking here in our own Muslim communities, the amount of authority that we are expected to give to religious leaders. And I want to kind of have nuance that term, in the sense that that can be anyone from a trained religious leader who has gone to a madrasa and has become a sheikh or a molana and so on, and they then will often have a small tariqa or a brotherhood around them. And yes, they're in that situation. The requirement is often uh, incredibly disciplined obedience at all costs. And what happens if you disobey are often very severe consequences. But within those circles, the issue then becomes is that there is one sheikh or one religious leader that cannot be questioned regardless of what they do. And that can often entail all forms of abuse, so that is one. And when I say nuances, so that's one form of kind of a religious leader. But these types of individuals within the realm of kind of religion can also be can be academics who are in the field of Islamic studies or in any other studies, but at least are positioning themselves as as experts in the field of Islam, and do then kind of motivate at people who are just entering, say, undergraduate programs, motivate them by their rhetoric, by that authoritative figure, which of course happens in universities with all people, but in this situation, what makes it so even more disturbing is, of course, this is the realm of religion in which young undergraduate students, for example, are coming to kind of seek some guidance, not only in their studies, but also to help them not only intellectually grow, but ethically, morally, and
Mm.
so on. And so these individuals are given that authority, and that authority, we again, now ample empirical evidence, is abused time and time again, and abused in ways that are just horrific.
Mhm.
So that's the way, it usually plays out. You have the individual, charismatic or not, but regardless of whether they're charismatic, but they have them. And at some point, when these young men are around them, and there's extreme cases in which kind of you will see sheikhs, having these young men, which I've seen with my own eyes, kissing their feet, kissing their hands, and and all of these things. And then one can say, okay, well, basically, these young people that are just entering into adulthood from childhood, they're going to do whatever these people say most of the time. And you can almost predict that some forms of abuse are going to take place, and perhaps even incredibly horrific forms.
Mhm.
So I think this is the way it kind of plays out typically.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for enlightening us with that. You've kind of sketched this scene. And I think many of us who've been to universities often, we join these groups. And as you said, there's this almost like a tariqa or a brotherhood system that
Yeah,
forms. I want to kind of hone in a little bit on one of the points that you made specifically about, they use faith and they weaponize faith in a way, right? And hearing this, people often assume, rather, that it is imams or spiritual guides in a way who
yeah,
are the ones perpetrating. However, sometimes those very perpetrators can be rather progressive or portray themselves as progressive individuals. So that I find, how does that happen? Where we have they're corrupt internally and they're portraying themselves as you know, pious figures who are also very open minded. So, if you could tell us a little bit about how they set their scene, how did they prey upon young men?
absolutely. And I will certainly get into kind of my own experience with precisely this phenomena in a moment. But I did. This is part of the larger nuance that I want to give to this, in the sense that the way, I mean, now we can use this kind of very straightforward language. These individuals in these positions of authority, the ones that engage in this type of predatory, abusive behavior, whether it's sexual, verbal, whatever it may be, um, they fall all along the ideological, theological spectrum. I think this is an incredibly important point that we must realize right now, because and this does not obviously let off the hook the straw man mullah or mulana that we say, that whether in the madrasa or whether as a sheikh, etc., that do engage in this stuff. It's not that we're letting them off the hook. It's just that we are saying that those that have gotten away with a lot of the abuse solely because their rhetoric has been one that claims to be so progressive on a whole array of issues and so on, particularly on issues of gender, particularly on that's one of the mainstays. If we're arch feminists, etc., and believe in social justice, that in some ways we are immune. There's no point in even looking at what this person does, because just that rhetoric sounds so good coming from from a Muslim, a Muslim in a position of authority. And so this is an important point you raise, that we now realize that these men that claim to be progressives, whether as traditionally trained religious leaders, or in academia as an academic or scholar of in Islamic studies, that the rhetoric is nothing. That
Mm,
talk is cheap. That we need to seriously take into account now, that what those individuals, men particularly, we're talking about, who are in Islamic studies, and of course, this is not to generalize. They're very good, committed individuals, who engage in incredibly good work, and have great politics, very progressive. But of course, there are many of them that just hide behind the rhetoric of progressive politics and social views and so on, etc. And meanwhile, engage in the same forms of abuse that the other categories of the traditionally trained religious leader would
mhm.
be engaged in. Yeah,
Right, right. Yes, you very, very important point you highlighted there, and takes me to my next question or talking point, which is, we talk about these. young, impressionable men who kind of unquestionably trust these
Yeah.
preachers or figureheads who turn out to be abusers. But how do these abusers manage to inspire these young men to listen to them, to engage with them? Of course, you said that they have this rhetoric. Let's open that or unpack that a little bit. So surely there's a sense of cult of personality, and I wonder, is that rather Rasputin-esque, or is that like, is it a kind of like a cult following? How does that work? How do they amass this fanfare?
Right. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is, from all that I have seen, uh, it is a cult of personality. From whether I have seen this in the United States, in South Africa, the United Kingdom, or in Pakistan,
Hmm.
uh, all of the cases of whether it is again, like I said, a traditionally trained religious scholar or an alim, or whether it is someone knowledgeable, supposedly in Islamic
Hmm.
studies, and uh, that ultimately it comes down to the theology. You name it, whatever theology. It's a theology. It's a cultish theology. That's what it is, ultimately. And I've seen this everywhere. Now there can be degrees of it, of how much it is, and I think that that's where, particularly in the context of what my own experience, in the realm of kind of academia, or particularly academics, progressive academics who have the training in Islam as well, and the way they build cults of personalities, um, with their students, with literally their students and young men that effectively become, to put it very bluntly, their groupies. Uh, and the way they do this is I mean, it's so mischievous and manipulative, because again, they're in the as we all know, I mean, a professor or so on, they're already in a position of authority and power. And in this case, we're talking about kind of a religious studies and Islamic studies person who is also using that the deployment of, and in my case, I will stick to this, very progressive, very liberationist type of rhetoric that, for people, young people these days, can be incredibly appealing when they're entering their undergraduate program, and when they may have experienced kind of somewhat of an alienation from more conservative interpretations or traditional interpretations and so on, in their community, and are looking for some alternative, or may have even given up. But
Mm.
then when such a figure emerges, espousing this rhetoric of progressive, Islam and so on, and liberation theology and whatever have you. You that it's so easy, and add to the fact that they're charismatic and so on. Their work, their writings, very good. You learn a lot from them and so on. Um, so it becomes very easy then for them to attract not only just you, but so many of the incoming classes of students and students and students. So it's just like they have an entire kind of a whole lot to just choose from. And obviously we're speaking right now about those that abuse that power
Mm.
that they wield. We're talking about those academics, particularly the progressive ones, that abuse that power, to then locate the ones that they think that, okay, yeah, I mean, this person really is attracted to what I say in public, and therefore I can manipulate him in any way possible. Him personally, him as part of the political causes that I also am manipulating, and so on. So I think that this is the central factor in this entire process, particularly, and I'm focusing on this because I think that there has been a lot of already kind of a lot of research done on how the traditionally trained sheikhs and molanas, etc., the authority that's kind of automatically by default given to them by the Muslim community and so on, that type of thing. And this has not been focused on as much, the way that and academics within Islamic studies who also kind of then want to play the role of kind of, also, okay, you don't have to go to the Molana, you don't have to go to a sheikh. I'm an academic that knows Islam really well, and I can also give you spiritual guidance. And I can be both the kind of social and political figure that you look up to, but also the spiritual and the religious figure that you can look up to, and you don't need anyone else. And those are the conditions then in which they have you trapped. They have you
Right.
trapped, and all forms of abuse can take place.
It feels almost more than just a cult of personality. It's almost very like a fake messiah that they're
Yeah.
portraying themselves out to be. Well, obviously I say fake because they use that not only to wield control over a cause, a political cause, but over also leverage over the individuals who they have all the trust in the world, all of their trust of those individuals, that they abuse them, abuse their position of power. And as you said, it's multi-layered, so many levels. But let's focus a little bit now on the survivors themselves. So, of course,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing with us that you yourself are a survivor of this, and of course, this is why it is such an important cause to you. So let's discuss a little bit, centering those survivors. Um, so many young men I've had reach out to me as well through the work that I've been doing, and they're asking, Miriam, you often talk about women, you talk about domestic abuse in the case of women, and we get it. It's a patriarchal society that we live in.
Yes.
However, that patriarchy also undermines me. It also sabotages me as a young man. So I think that's really interesting when I hear that from survivors. So if you could tell us a little bit about the impacts that spiritual abuse of this nature can have specifically on young and vulnerable men.
Absolutely. And Miriam, I really am inclined to share my own kind of survivor story, um, in the sense that obviously we know that each and every case has its own particular dynamics, and I think that the reason I want to share at least some like very disturbing parts of my own story is to show kind of almost what the extreme case can look like in terms of the degree of manipulation and abuse that such a figure can engage in trapping you. And so, as basically a survivor of almost a decade of abuse by an academic. I've written about this as well. Um, the things that I observed, and only after much repression of, because uh, again, and this is kind of a message to kind of people, that I hope it gets through to, that only after kind of recognizing, or actually only by repressing it, by repressing what had happened during that decade, could I live with myself in the sense of feeling that, look, this was my formative years of my intellectual, moral, and growth, and so on, and I didn't. You don't want it to seem like just a waste, and so you try to provide justifications. You sometimes, very often, blame yourself, etc. All sorts of things, and of course, repression is one of the vehicles. And it was only until I had to, I saw that I could see the impact of that decade of abuse in terms of my family, my career, all of these things, and I could, and that required counseling, that required therapy, in order to get it out and see, why am I in the position right now, in this position, um, where I should have been in somewhere else by now. And so I think that I think the way that I mean, and I'll be very explicit in my case, it was you know, if you're dealing with someone who is, in my case, it was an academic who's just a grand manipulator in every way, and I don't know why God gave him this gift, but yes, a grand manipulator. I mean, not just in my case, but it's very clear in all in all angles and areas of his life. But the way that my the like the deepest parts of my private life, um, my family, my marriage, even my child, my parents, etc., to kind of insert yourself into the person's life, uh, impress upon the young male's family that this guy, that is just he is the Messiah. I think you used the right word. That yes, he is the Messiah. That and particularly coming, us as Muslims, as faith based. So I mean, yeah, I mean, how can the parents complain? And this is great, Otherwise, the kid may just become a secular liberal left wing character. So this is wonderful. And so the levels of manipulation of that, the manipulation of particularly the abuse related to, say, sexual advancements or sexual abuse, is also preying upon, particularly for us from the Muslim world, etc. Me particularly from Pakistan and South Asia, preying upon the whole kind of, you spoke about patriarchy and the associated heteronormativity of the world, and of course how this plays out in a context like South Asia. Now, I'm not saying that the rest of the world is so friendly, homosexual friendly, but the point is that these are kind of things that they prey upon because they know that these individuals will remain silent, that they can get away with it. First of all, you've already handed them, so much authority because of, you think they are the ideal progressive liberation theologian or so on. Be very frank about it. And you've already handed that to them. And then they can basically, like I was saying earlier, they can make all of the decrees. They can give all the fatwas, if you want, about what you can and cannot do in your life. Meanwhile, engaging in their own abuse against you. And so that is an age in which, at least for me, incredibly confusing on how to deal with a situation like that when they have kind of manipulated every aspect of your life, all the way down to your child, uh, in order to kind of keep you in place, so that they have the complete control over you. And that control entails not only kind of, just the typical control over what you cannot do, your behavior, etc., but control in terms of also their own ability to abuse you, to
Mm.
make their sexual advancements again towards you, to sexually abuse you, to do whatever they want, from which you run away from. But it is a constant. It is a constant thing. And for me, it was a decade. So I share this because it is the horror story that I want people to hear, that that can potentially happen when you give these people that type of authority. Which is not to say that they're very genuine mentors that help you along your in your intellectual, moral, ethical trajectory throughout your life. There are certainly those, but there are certainly these types as well that will, and that may be the extreme one that I've just described, but even if it's not that extreme, it must be avoided at all costs.
Right.
So
Right. Thank you immensely for sharing that, and that too so concisely, given that it's a whole decade of experiences and trauma that you are not just carrying with you, but you've made such a grand effort to overcome it. I really commend you for that, Junaid. And also for you mentioned quite a few things, just like I'll begin. I think I'll try and be as coherent as possible with this. We talked about sexuality and, of course, the sexual abuse that also goes hand in hand with the spiritual abuse, specifically when it's directed towards young men in Muslim communities, whereby it's a very specific nature, as you said. They're often. At least some of the survivors who I speak to, and they come to me and they say, you know, I was, for instance, as a young child, young boy, I was abused by a male figurehead in my family or in the mosque or the society or community. And for many, many years, I held that with me because when I tried to share it with my mother or my family, I was immediately, my sexuality was immediately questioned. It was as if it's this degree of victim blaming, whereby not only do we say that the victim was,
Right.
God forbid, I hate the term, asking for it, but it was almost like their very internal being, their identity, who they are, every single aspect of them is not only questions, it's interrogated to such an nth degree that I just, so I'm grateful and appreciative that we are having this conversation. And I think, to round it up, I would like to ask you for,
Mariam, if I could just say one
yes,
thing
yeah,
within that, and
please do.
you know, and the difficulty for me, and quite frankly, I mean, when I first confronted the abuser, uh, you know, this issue of kind of almost a taboo of speaking
Yes.
about this within family, community, and so on, precisely for the reasons you say, and yeah. So for me, it was a degree even more because obviously I'm in my adulthood now. I'm in my 20s and so on, and I'll be quite honest with you that the only reason I confronted the abuser, I had repressed this, was because, I mean, my abuser, of course, had no shame. I mean, none of them have any shame, but this was the most shameless individual who, even after, one of the biggest tragedies in my life, after my father had passed away, still continued. So after I parted, when I say parted ways, never said anything rude or mean. Only the abuse would be a one-sided way. But I had to escape. I had to escape. And since that time, which was about 2009, he went on and on to exclude me because we're the similar spaces and circles of kind of
Mm,
whether activists and academic to exclude me, to speak bad about me, etc., and so on. And the only reason that I came out, and I stress this because that the reason that you just mentioned, that the taboo of kind of this sexual, all this advancements and abuse by another male, this type of thing, is very big in our communities, and that we kind of keep quiet about it, and particularly me as an adult, that I really think that probably this would have been buried until the day I died, but the cruelty of the person was just so much, that in 2017, in his kind of again denial of a space which he had no right to deny me to come to, at that point is actually when I came out. I said that now, the one person that I did not want to hurt, that I knew would be pained the most, um, who would want to have protected me from such a predator, would have been my father, and he was no longer in this world. And so at that point, I said that I'm not letting this guy off the hook.
right.
And at that point, and so this was my really like opening up and then writing it very publicly. Of course, I had a group of friends that were throughout supportive, but it was basically a 3 to 4 year long process of me getting therapy and so on, and trying to deal with this, and finally coming out. I mean, I initially with a very small confrontation, letting them know that look, but then kind of get through the therapy, understanding the extent of the abuse
Right.
of over that decade, and also understanding that look, the ideas, liberation theology, progressive, that if the ideas are good, they will be protected by God. That's fine.
Exactly.
But that's fine. they're not the person. The person's behavior, for that he must be held accountable. And it's when I came to that conclusion, and I said that that is more important, not only because I will, I'll have to overcome this difficulty of the taboo of this type of male to male abuse, but also in saving other victims
Yeah.
that potentially would emerge, and other survivors that this
Mm.
person has had. So that is the reason why I
Yeah.
chose to make it public.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. And that's, you know, so many things that you picked up on there, that not only is there this taboo that you're buried under, but also the ostracization, the silencing of survivors, all of this, even when somebody does go public, the way in which the wider community either stands by or is enabling, it's this divide. So we on this side want to help survivors. We want them to speak out. We want them to feel safe, hence save. So on that note, I would like you to basically speak a little bit to any of our listeners who are survivors out there. What sort of advice would you give them, you know, uh, on how to safeguard themselves or protect themselves, or even just any sort of guidance that you would like to give?
Right. I think that, I mean, it may sound very simple, but I think that um, when I mean, and of course the context vary of kind of where the survivor is coming from. I mean, the survivor could have been a child,
Exactly.
um, and at that point, I really don't know kind of how they can, what possibilities there are for them to prevent their abuse. So but the message that I can kind of, or the people, the audience that I could really speak to, are people that kind of are going to university or high school even, and or university for their undergraduate or whatever graduate school and so on, as well as individuals that really admire a religious leader
Mhm.
for whatever reasons. I mean, they may not be my reasons for admiring, but it's always kind of as a believer, as someone who, as a Muslim. I mean, there's no one that is above the transcendent, is above God, and so keeping that in mind at all times, for me as a Muslim, the principle of kind of Tawheed, that God is at the top. There's that none of these other characters, they can help you, they can guide you, they can be supportive, etc. All of these things. That's what you need to keep in mind. But they are human beings. They are human beings. And we are all human beings, and we are all flawed human beings. But some are incredibly sick and disturbing human beings that engage in this type of behavior. So, I mean, if I could just say, I mean, one thing to these young men, and of course young women as well, who are entering it, it is about always keeping that critical lens, um, always, I mean, we are Muslims, we're respectful, we're all of these things. We are in search for knowledge. These are the keys. We're not in search for heroes or messiahs. When the Mahdi or the Messiah will come, he or she will come. Okay, but that's a separate story. We are This is what we are taught to be in search of knowledge, of good people, of good guidance, and that's it. We're not in search of these individual cult leaders, which is the case that happens. They want to become a cult leader,
Mm.
and this is what we cannot allow them and enable them to become. And that can only happen is if we remember that our task is to learn the knowledge from them, to be
Mhm.
respectful, to be very grateful for whatever we've learned or have grown in certain ways, have been supported, etc. But nothing beyond that.
Mhm.
We owe them nothing beyond that. And when they think,
Right.
start to believe that you do owe them more than that, that is the warning signal that this could go in a direction that can be incredibly abusive and manipulative. So that would be my
Excellent,
very
excellent.
humble
And if I
advice.
may, I know I'm just extending it a little bit
Yeah.
further, but this point got me thinking. What sort of advice, or what should we implement in wider society? Those who are amongst us, those who are allies, what would you like for them to do?
I think that on that point, this is, I mean, I think incredibly crucial because it is precisely this broader your community. Now, those communities, when we say, it could be various. You have different communities. You can have your community of your kind of your Muslim community where you live, etc. It could be your community of your academic friends. It could be your activist community, so on and so forth. Uh, but the point is, it's we are social human beings as social beings, and therefore we do rely on these communities,
We do.
and we rely on them, and that is when that we see that is when we have to see whether they step up to the plate or not. I mean, that is the litmus test
Mm,
of whether that is your community or not. Uh, because when in these types of cases, as you know very well, and most people will know very well, a survivor, a victim and a survivor, it is incredibly difficult for them to come out. I mean, I mean, I've already said it, but of course, for me, it was, on various levels, it was incredibly difficult to come out. And of course, by after 3 4 years of support and therapy, by that point I was like, I'm doing this regardless of who will stand by. Of course, you one does see that, like, who are those people that have also been espousing the same kind of very progressive, very kind of progressive feminist credentials and rhetoric, etc., and how will they now react? But even beyond that, how will the community, how will a larger community react?
mhm.
So what I wanted to, I mean, I'm kind of going speaking
Okay.
incoherently here, but the point is that they what the point of all of this is to say that they are actually essential. They are essential for survivors, in terms of solidarity and support. And that, in fact, it's sad to say, but that is often not received. That is often not received. And so then, when survivors do speak out, they, I mean, anything can hit them. They can be blamed. They can, all sorts of things they may have to confront when they should not have to confront any of those things. There's
Right.
just one thing that should happen, that should be solidarity and support, unquestionably.
Absolutely.
And we don't, and then the problem is that's not what we get. And then when we say that, okay, why don't they speak up more, or why don't they speak up right away, or all of these things. It's so silly because we know why.
We
we
do.
we really know why, because every time they do, what is the reaction? Why is there not a unanimous, particularly from such a, I mean, people that come from such a beautiful, rich faith tradition
Hmm.
that stands up for social justice?
Mm,
Eh, Yet communities, even those that have nice sounding rhetoric on these things, immediately, where's the courage? I mean, uh, to the courage just to say that I'm in support and solidarity with the victim. I mean, then you kind of ask yourself, what's this community become? So I think that is the responsibility of the
absolutely.
community, and I think that's so inbuilt within our religion itself,
Absolutely.
that that it's so shameful when it doesn't happen,
Mm,
and it doesn't happen a lot.
mm,
And so, speaking personally, I mean, I have been fortunate, to receive a lot of solidarity and support. But of course, there are the people, also in my case, that will also kind of ask questions. Why so much later? Why this? Why that? Speaking about this, all sorts of things.
Mm,
They will come up with. And the issue itself of abuse is not even being addressed. So it's
absolutely.
so
Mm,
it is incumbent. It is absolutely incumbent on the community, on your religious community, your activist community, your academic, whatever it may be, whatever. But particularly when we're speaking about your kind of your religious, the Muslim community, to take a very strong position on this. No one's saying to that yes, the abuser must be stoned to death immediately, but what we are saying is that the survivor must receive the solidarity and support, yes, immediately.
absolutely.
Because if they have had the courage to do the what is impossible because we don't receive that support, to come out publicly, then the community should have at least the kind of minimal, they can put in the minimal effort to give them the solidarity and support they need at that point. And if they don't do it, I would argue it is a betrayal of their
Mm.
faith of their faith tradition. I would put it as strongly as that.
Right, right. Thank you so much for not only inspiring so many people, but actually being a role model for so many survivors out there. I mean, may your voice reverberate across the world, and may your advice and guidance and all that you've said be a call to action for all our listeners, that we all play a part, that we are this community. And as a community of faith, as you said rightly, it is our duty, it is our moral and religious obligation to stand on the side of the oppressed. Otherwise, we will be amongst the oppressors. So that is it for today. Thank you so much, Junaid, for joining us. And inshallah, we'll keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for having me, and I hope I did make my own modest contribution to helping others and other survivors to know that they're not alone.
They are not alone. We are with you. Thank you.